Look, this is recording live already. I've already hit the button, so we may as well get straight into it, hey?
Okay. Now I see
Awesome.
you got a comment about my name, Jacob.
Yeah.
Which
I
is,
feel really daft for never having put that together before.
well, bushel of wheat, you see. So it's it is something I've thought about a little bit, because it's funny. I had zero growing up on a farm, and sitting in tractors and bouncing around on the weekend when I could have been having fun with my mates. I wasn't that interested in agriculture. I got accepted into engineering at UTS in Sydney, and I went up there and studied that for about 6 months. But I hated living in Sydney, so I moved back home. But isn't it funny? There's a really good dentist here in Temora called Chris Chew. Yeah, it's actually really common, isn't it, when you meet people?
Yeah, well, apparently, depending on how you pronounce the surname Wolki in German, it can mean the word cloud, and I've been told I've got my head in the clouds before, so there we go. The whole pattern
Okay.
keeps knocking on. So
Yep.
you went and did engineering for 6 years in Sydney and decided soy
Six.
lattes weren't for you, because I'm sure that would have been in the 2000s. It wouldn't have been too long ago. You spring chicken like myself.
It was a long time ago, Jacob. No, it was only 6 months. I did it for 6 months and didn't like living in Sydney. So, the course was okay, but it was very, I thought I'm locking myself into a half an hour train ride in the morning. I was living with my uncle up at Chatswood, so it was a pretty quick run into Sydney on the train. But, too many people, and sitting inside, being in an office all day didn't really appeal to me. So I came back home, and
You came home. Yeah. So how long before you started studying agronomy once you came home?
I started the following year, basically. So I did. So the course back in the day, I had to do 6 months in Sydney, and then 6 months practical work. So I basically did I did my 6 month study in Sydney at the UTS, and I came back to Temora, and I was working actually laying sort of a rural water pipe scheme. So I worked on that for 6 months, and that was actually good, because I did some work that I got paid for. So that was quite that was nice, coming off a farm where you just did it because you're about. But then I thought, oh no, thought I would try this ag science, and I really enjoyed it. So I've been doing it ever since then. That was a long time ago, Jacob. I've been an agronomist for 30 years now. So quite a bit of time out in the paddock digging up soil, basically.
I've been in the paddock with you a few times, and we've always had to take a spade with us. Is that a prerequisite? Yep. Will all agronomists grab a shovel and use a shovel in a field, or is that something a little bit unique?
It's changed a lot in the last couple of years, Jacob. I'd probably say yes. Look, you take a shovel. Probably in the early days, you had a shovel to dig yourself out of a bog or something like that. But no, look, it's probably become. I think the interest in soil and soil health has increased, definitely. I think the simple fact that it costs you a lot more to deal with that soil, whether you buy it or however you manage to get hold of some land to start with. So, that's definitely changed, which is a good thing. I still not a lot of farmers probably do dig up much of their paddock, unfortunately, which is a bit of a shame. Soil pits are a really interesting learning tool. Tom Briggs actually had a good soil pit with the Vic No-Till down at his farm at Rutherglen last year, and actually came up with some really interesting things just from digging a pit down a metre in the soil and having a look at where the roots go. So he actually had a really interesting. He'd done a trial down there for a couple of years. He'd sown some summer species in a paddock, just trying to feed his sheep, but also trying to improve the infiltration and the soil structure. It's Nicola from Nutrisoil. She was there. She got quite interested and took some soil tests, and there was a heap more carbon where he'd run this summer cover crop for a couple of years in the soil. I haven't got the figures in front of me, but it was quite a significant increase in a really short space of time, which is quite encouraging, actually.
And was that deep carbon?
No, I think they took, yes, they did. They took a range of depths, Jake. So, yeah, 0 to 10. When a lot of farmers talk about carbon, it's most of it's based on a 0 to 10 soil test, which is really just 100 mils or 4 inches. Which really the plants, if you got a plant only growing in the top 10 centimeters, you're in a bit of trouble because it's going to dry out very quickly. So yeah, it's a good idea to test a bit deeper than that, or at least have a look anyway.
That's something that I've noticed going in the paddock with you a couple of times lately, is a lot of these crops that were, they might have been young crops or failed crops, or maybe it was the status quo. You can tell me, but we're digging down and we're seeing the roots go down about 30 mil, and then they just shoot out horizontal.
Yep. Yeah. It's amazing though. The so-called weeds grow well, don't they? Like the Bathurst burrs, very, very rarely look sick. So I think part of I guess my learning experience has been try and notice what's happening around you. Keep an eye on things, and you go, why these weeds keep coming up in this paddock? What's going on there, and I guess in my role, I obviously an agronomist deal with weeds. That's probably, so I guess my background is I did a Bachelor of Applied Science, which is a 3-year degree. I think it's a little bit longer now. And then I went off working in a retail store, which is very common for agronomists. There's a lot of retail. So most farmers are really getting their advice from a retail-based agronomist. You go into town to a Nutrien or Elders, and you talk to the young agronomist there, and you fill up your ute with a bit of chemical or seed, and you go home. And I probably touched on it in a podcast I did with our friend Dr. Max. You sort of, I've likened it very, very, it's like being a pharmacy basically, as in pH, in that I'd feel like I'd go out on farm and I'd write a script out for a farmer on my notepad, and now I do it on the iPad. And you send that recommendation off, and they go and get a ute load of spray, or potentially a truckload these days, and they go and spray their crop, and then a week or a month later, they come back and get another one to spray it again. So, yeah, it's very much changed in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, probably from an input point of view, which is, why farmers definitely feel the squeeze. I think, they're squeezed because we're in a production model where we're trying to always increase production, which is really hard in a natural-based system. We're pushing the system all the time.
Talking about that pharmacy model, working in a store, filling scripts out, that sort of thing. I wanted to ask you about the sales model behind that, and I guess a little bit about how that business works, and if there's any, I guess, bonuses or incentives. I don't want to make you some sort of nuclear no-go zone in the industry, but I'd like to get a little bit of the insight, and I want to share a little bit about my own experience in this. In our bicycle store, we have set up many KPIs for our staff over the years. So a KPI being a key performance index. If you do this, we'll give you that. And I gave my workshop manager a labour bonus. So the workshop in the bicycle shop is there to repair and service bicycles for customers and to build bikes for the floor. And I gave them a labour bonus target, dish out this amount of labour and we'll give you a bonus. And all of a sudden the shop was empty because they just refused to build bicycles anymore because it wasn't incentivized. And they were cutting their nose off to spite their face, because down the tube of the business's next 6-12 months, there'd be no new bikes coming back for their new services. Similarly, I've given managers sales targets of so hit this gross profit to keep our gross profit up, and sales started diving because they wouldn't discount to get a deal anymore. And there's all these unintended consequences, and it's really hard to sort of wrap in all those externalities and have a really positive, holistic outcome. In light of my shortcomings with our sales models, did you see anything happening just in your stock standard sort of fill a script sort of model, like you said?
Yeah, but basically, look, very, very similar. I mean, most businesses are probably the same as you move. If you move up into more of a management role, most private businesses have some sort of incentive type bonus. So, it's all done differently. So years ago, you probably had the option when businesses are smaller, like you might, I might work for Jacob Wolki in his bike shop. When you went to retire, I might sort of take on the business or something like that. So that probably happened 20 or 30 years ago. But if you look now, most of those independent, and we talked about it the other day, Jacob, that little independent shop in Albury shut down. Basically, most now, if you look at any country town, Nutrien's owned by Agrium out of Canada. Elders is Australian, but it's certainly Australia-wide. So it's funny. It's really followed the whole retail space has followed the sort of supermarket model a little bit. Whoops-a-daisy. So, it's very, very similar, I suppose. Yes, we were incentivised, if the business made a profit. It's all, and it's really hard if you're starting off in the industry. I've been there a long time, so I sort of probably got to a stage, where I just did what I wanted to, Jacob, and rode my own boat a little bit. Because I guess really in my role, I was really dealing with farmers, right? And it's a little bit different. Say I'm selling a car in Sydney, well, I'd have a different person walk in every day. Whereas if I'm dealing in a little town, I have the same 30 farmers come in every year, right? Or whatever it is, and you play sport with those people on the weekend. So really the focus of my work was looking after those farmers to the best of my ability. And what I'd find doing that is that, they respected your opinion. And they would talk to a, their other neighbour, and what ended up happening, you ended up getting the business anyway, if you know what I mean, just simply because you were doing a good job. But yes, probably one of the unknown things in the industry. There's old products, like if I compare it to say human health, like you've got you've got paracetamol or what was it originally? Panadol's the brand name. Now you can buy Panadol, paracetamol made in, I don't know, downtown Beijing or somewhere, and that's really the same as what's happened with the chemical industry. So as a company, say a company like Bayer might produce something like glyphosate or Roundup was their trade name back in the 70s. As the patent comes off, someone in Monsanto would leave and start up their own company. Somewhere cheaper like China or Malaysia, where labour's cheaper. GNS levels are not what they are in Australia. Actually, whilst I was talking to you on the phone today, Jacob, I pulled up and I was going to take a photo. There was a stop and go sign with the traffic lights, and there's two blokes sitting in a ute in the front. So I had a traffic light, and there must be two people at each traffic light to watch what's going on. And I thought, oh, this is what a nanny state we live in. Like there's a traffic light there, but there's two people. And there's about one grader and one truck on the road, and four people worried about the sign at either ends. If you look at the regulation, we just can't seem to make anything in Australia, unfortunately. Hence everything goes offshore, basically. But as far as generic chemistry goes, that's sort of the deal there. So what happens is a lot of stuff is the tech product either comes in and it's formulated. Even these days, I think the formulation's even cheaper overseas, so it comes in a container, comes into the country and then is distributed. But there's also the R&D products that have a patent on them. They generally have some sort of rebate behind the line. So if you come in and want to buy a product that's just been recently released, it's a funny system because the retail business actually can't change the price on that, or they'll lose their agency, right? And it's probably similar in a lot of different industries. So there's something like a 20% rebate behind the line, as they call it. Yeah, the farmer can't save any money, and the store can't change, the retail price either. So it's very much a locked-in system. So it doesn't matter where you go, you pay the same price. So yeah, I was reading something the other day about how GMO crops had sort of reduced the amount of chemistry being used, and I think if you asked an average farmer in Australia, particularly in the cropping belt, you see a drop off in some chemical use, but it generally leads to another one, because what happens, you kill the weeds or whatever's growing in the soil, and you get some bare ground. So then another weed comes up that needs a different bit of chemistry on it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, Jacob.
Well, it's interesting you're saying that these manufacturers and wholesalers of these chemicals are enforcing a fixed retail price in the bicycle industry, which is where I've spent the last 14 years. There was one wholesaler that tried to enforce the retail price of their goods, and they tried in quite cunning ways. They weren't doing it outright. They were doing it in some sneaky ways we won't get into now, but essentially they were strong arming their resellers, their retail accounts, so not discounting these products in the marketplace. And they got taken to court for price fixing, and they lost. They had a $500,000 cash payout they had to give for for price fixing in the marketplace. So I'm sure these companies are bigger and more sophisticated, and it just sort of shows you that the intent of a lot of these businesses is the same. They're trying to, control the market, and even though it's against, healthy competitive behavior, they've got big enough, deep enough pockets to, pay the lawyers to get them out of it. It's interesting what you say about GMO crops claiming less chemicals are used, but your experience is more. When you first started, do you have any memories? I know you're from a family of farmers. Do you have any memories of your father pulling crops out of the ground with little to no chemistry used on them, or is that sort of your history? Were these normal chemicals, normal, air quotes, normal, still being used back then when you were younger?
No, so Jacob, given I've been doing it a while, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, so it was really, it probably wasn't far off an organic farming system. Dad's always had livestock and crops, a true mixed farm. So you grow, a paddock of clover and lucerne, which improves your soil, puts some nitrogen back in the soil, and then you'd crop it for, you might run that for maybe 5 to 10 years, depending on your particular farm, and then you'd put crop back in it. So, but no, there was a lot more cultivation, Jacob. So I remember sitting on an old tractor, and that's why I'm probably talking a little bit loud. I'm a bit deaf, and yeah, I just remember sitting on a tractor on the weekend ploughing up a paddock. So when I went to university, and you find out about no-till farming, and this was early in the 90s, I think glyphosate was originally, the first chemistry is probably something like 2,4-D-amine. So that was used in wheat to kill like broadleaf weeds like wild radish and thistles, which would make the crop hard to harvest. So that would have been some of the first chemistry back in the sort of probably after the Second World War, basically. I mean,
how does it make the crop hard to harvest, Dave?
What if it's full of thistles? The thistles will still be green, whereas the wheat, as you know, in November it gets hot and dry. The wheat senesces and dies off. So if you have a milk thistle or a black thistle or a variegated thistle, they'll still be quite green because they're still going through their life cycle. Or back in the day, skeleton weed was the main one, ran Tamora. Or Skello, and that would block up the front of the header. So yeah, you go forward 2 meters and you'd block up the front of the header. So you'd have to unblock it, basically get out and do it by hand and unblock the front of the header, which is pretty dangerous. Yeah, and it's I guess farmers, that new technology comes along, and if it improves things, you take it up. I guess it went from but if you go back to those days, Jacob, it's probably it would be one spray maybe every 3 or 4 years, right? Whereas now we've gone into a no-till farming regime, which is very productive. You're not using one spray, you're using one spray. A high intensive paddock sort of in southern New South Wales has probably maybe had 3 or 4 summer sprays. It'll have a pre-emergent, it'll have a couple of post-emergents, and it may even have this dreaded desiccation that you know a little bit about, Jacob, I believe.
Not
so
enough,
you look
apparently.
at that a year. Like that's, we've gone from one spray back in the 50s like I said, maybe every second or third year. I feel like the pendulum swung the other way. There's no doubt back in the 60s and 70s and even 80s, we cultivated too much, right? So when I learned about all this stuff at uni and, you could, instead of spending a whole day on the tractor working up 70 acres, you could spray it in about half an hour with half a litre of glyphosate, and the paddock, you killed the weeds. It was magic. So farmers really embraced it. I guess the problem is a lot of young farmers now and young agronomists have never actually grown a crop or a pasture without that. So they're sort of, that's the only way they know. Whereas, we did grow food before 1950.
What would the yield have been in a low chemical but heavy tillage? From my understanding in your neck of the woods, David, like a bumper year for wheat per hectare might be 4 ton. Obviously correct me if I'm out of place, but that would be great. 1.5, 2 ton would be acceptable. You're paying the bills, and anything less than that's a bit of a failure. Is that about right?
One of my neighbours has got some really good figures, and I think he's done, what would it be now? Probably a 30-year average for him is a 3-ton wheat crop. So you're right. We are just north of Temora, about 3 ton per hectare of wheat. And if you head south to sort of through Culcairn, to Albury, you're probably around 4 ton. Basically, is probably not a bad figure to work on.
So what were we harvesting when we were doing heavy tillage with no glyphosate to knock down the pasture before sowing? Back when young Bushy was rattling along after his failed engineering career.
It's a completely different, but I mean, yes, we were still growing 4 and 5 ton wheat crops, but instead of doing it on across the whole farm or thousands of hectares, we would, like I said, we'd bring in a clover paddock and plough it up. So you had that natural nutrition there, right? So you put a bit of super under it, which in the case it would have been MAP, and probably didn't even worry about urea because you had the natural nitrogen there from your clover and legume build-up. Really, we were growing basically the same yield, but it was a very low input system, Jacob. So we're relying on the natural build-up of fertility in the soil, probably build-up of carbon and other things, and then we'd plough it up, which would release that carbon and mineral from the soil, and then and then what we tend to do if you grew that paddock of wheat, well then you might sow it out with barley with some, again, lucerne clover. So it was more that sort of carried on right up to, because you might know, Jacob, but back in the 80s there was a reserve wool price scheme. So you took a bale of wool in and sold it. It had a minimum price. So it's a bit like the Americans have now with their insurance. They don't necessarily have a minimum price, but they have a minimum. If they don't produce enough income per hectare, the government gives them a big fat check in the States, right? Yeah, obviously, in Australia in the 80s, the wool and sheep were really good until about the late 80s when the reserve price scheme crashed. And it was a bit of there's always something happening in agriculture, a bit like the live export debate at the moment. There was a lot of debate about the reserve price scheme, and they dropped that, which, I mean, it was just a regulated market. And obviously what that reserve price scheme did, it fostered the overproduction of wool. So farmers had heaps of wool sitting in their sheds here, there and everywhere, and it's taken a long, long time for that to filter through, basically. So it really, through the probably mid 90s when I left university, sheep were not far from being worthless and being shot, and they had foot rot and they had all sorts of problems. These new agronomists were coming out of uni with a few different ideas. Oh, you just spray the weeds with Roundup and you direct drill this crop and you grew 4 ton. It was pretty simple. So that was when the big change happened, is in the mid to late 90s, and it's been accelerating ever since then, Jacob, basically.
Yeah, well, this whole sheep caper, it's a big pendulum swinging, throughout the history of Australia, isn't it? When you read about the settlers that first came here and the amount of wealth they extracted through sheep and wool production, just absolutely incredible how efficient everything was. And there's multiple points. Yep. I've talked this at length on my live Wednesday broadcasts on my Facebook channel. It's not the first time we've had to shoot them. And, I just find it really, I don't want to criticize people in the position of having to cull their livestock because the government's rug pulled them. No one's more sympathetic to private enterprise being rug pulled by government. I think it's an atrocious use of government power. But at the same time, if this is the 6th, 8th, 10th time in the history of your family farm that you've had to shoot thousands of sheep, I would hope in my business that we'd have set up a little bit of a contingency or had a chat about, what if instead of, digging a pit and pouring these animals into it. Is there a name for killing mass killing of sheep? This brings me to a little bit when I do my farm tours, Dave, and I know that's the first time we met was on one of my farm tours, and thank you to yourself for making the time to come down and come along and meeting me. It's been the start of a really fun relationship. One of the things I normally do, I like to have a bit of fun with the people that are on the trip, and I say that we don't use any fungicide or herbicide or pesticide on our farm, and that's not all. We also don't do any homicide or suicide. And, obviously it's a bit of a silly play on words, the word side being Latin for death. And we've also got fratricide, which is friend on friend, murder. And, it is interesting. Like, it doesn't mean much. Most people know that, homicide and suicide are death, but they never think about these common agricultural terms of fungicide, herbicide, pesticide. They've become so accepting that they're just, a tool in the tool belt. No one really steps back to think what the word means and what the implications of that are long term.
Yeah, exactly. And, as we talked driving around the other day, Jacob, you look up the side of the road and you see all the grass growing and it's over the top of the fence, and you look in the paddock and it's either burnt or sprayed bare or worked up, right? And as I probably point, then if you burn the stubble, all of a sudden a few trees get singed and die off too. So it's it's a bit of a can be a bit depressing driving around, Jacob, looking at the countryside, to tell you the truth, because you look at, we wound down those country lanes there during the week, and you look at the sort of like a big silvo pasture, wasn't it, when the settlers came here and they're walking through on their horses, and you could only imagine what a Garden of Eden they thought it was. But in 200 odd years, it's it's quite interesting. If you measure the soil carbon in a naturally undisturbed bit of ground compared to the paddock, it's quite, we've virtually removed probably 2/3 to at least of the carbon in that soil, which is not a good thing, because it's not resilient. It doesn't store water in it anymore. I see it in my work. We sort of swing from, well, you're experiencing it a bit now. We swing from a drought to a flood very, very quickly, very quickly. Actually,
this is my first rodeo.
I was listening to the. Sorry.
This is my first rodeo. This is my first dry spell.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you'll experience them again. I think they've even come up with a new term. They call it a snap drought now.
Why not? We have snap floods.
Yeah. Well, I think what's happening, our soil's not resilient, so the water, it's either hard and dry, so the water runs straight off it if it comes down in an intense storm, or it just physically, without that mulch, and Walter Yenny calls it the soil, the carbon sponge, it just won't absorb the water, so it runs off the top basically, and then obviously it dries out again with evaporation. So we need to store water in the paddock in the profile. That's the important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, there's a few questions coming in on the chat screen, David, but I'd love to keep going on this little roll we've got if you've got a bit more time, and maybe we can address the questions at the end there. You were talking about
you tell me
driving along. Yep, I'll bring them up. We'll talk about driving along the countryside. Yep. So I think we'll have a quick little chat about Deara Heights, if you don't mind, and I'll just give everyone listening a bit of an intro. I'm not even entirely sure how this came about. Like I said, I met David on a farm tour, and a couple months later, I bumped into him again at the Regenerate Health Summit, which was in Albury last year, hosted by Dr. Max, and we had a good chat. I distinctly remember Mr. Bushell telling me how how much he loved wool, and he was wearing a nice woolen jumper, and he pointed out everyone else at this hippie carnivore festival was all wearing petroleum puffer vests. And I thought, this is my type of guy. Like, let's see blood. I want to taste it. Let's burn the whole thing down. I thought it was pretty funny. And I asked Dave to come to our new property in Wamargama that we purchased a little while ago, and just he drives past. He's up and down the highway all the time, and have a look. And if anything, I wanted to steal a bit of his hard-fought agronomy knowledge, and if anything was blaringly obvious, to point it out. And Dave, came and stopped in, and I said to him, look, I'd love to get into some more lease land up here. It's, one of the challenges I have. I can't afford a lot of land. Agricultural land's expensive. And I'm really wanting to get into some more blocks and some bigger blocks. And, not many months later, Mr. Bushell called me and said, oh, there's some blocks up here, Jake. Maybe we can do something on. We've engaged a third party, Mr. Jim Alexander, and the three of us are putting together a little enterprise up in West Wyalong, which will soon be the bastion of fertility, resilience, and breeding within central New South Wales. And we've leased a few thousand acres between the three of us, and we're going to be doing some mixed farming. So we've got some cattle there. The sheep are going up on Friday, a little bit of cropping. And what David was talking about previously was we were driving around the countryside between Temora and Wyalong on the back roads, getting to the lease block, and David's pulled over on the side of the road. The paddocks are thin, like they're cultivated, seeds just gone in, they're grazed down to nothing. Not that there's many animals to do grazing, most of it there is corporate cropping. And the side of the road that we pulled over on had kangaroo grass, which I've essentially never seen in a paddock before. I've only seen it in national parks when I've gone walking, and the kangaroo grass must have been 4 or 5 foot tall, bushy. They're all gone to seed and all thriving, and we all sort of pulled over and just fawned over it for 20 minutes, didn't we? Trying to steal a bit of seed out of it and see what it tasted like.
Yeah,
it's just amazing how prolific it is.
All of a sudden, Jim was going like a human whippersnipper, and yeah, any seed that was there is going back to the sunny slopes of Cootamundra.
Yeah, he filled his pockets up so fast he looked like the Scarecrow out of Wizard of Oz.
Yeah, but actually, it's funny, when I first was offered my original block up there, and you're right, it's a little bit in the backwoods. I think we passed Ivan Milat there coming the other way, possibly. It's sort of in the middle of nowhere. The trouble you've got down where you are, farms are really nearly real estate down there now, which is very common, within a city like Wagga. Albury's 100,000. We're 2 hours from Canberra. We went to visit my son up there the other day, and it's virtually nearly all. I actually think the hobby farms are a great thing, because they've turned bare sheep. If you drive between Canberra and Yass now, you've got trees and a bit of diversity. It's actually a nice drive. Whereas, like you said, you drive between Temora and West Wyalong, and it's a lot of big paddocks with burnt trees and big seeders and sprayers. It's really, and the bigger corporate farmers have certainly got really big. There's no doubt about that, because the little guys, like I suppose my father, you get squeezed out. So it's a really, I suppose back to Deara Heights, Jacob. We've all got different strengths. Jim brings a lot to the table. Like he's really into this natural intelligence movement, which he's spent some time with the Haggertys over in Western Australia. And actually, we had a really good dialogue the other day about what we're going to call our new farm. What's this new farming system? We threw a few ideas around, and the best, I think Jim come up with the best idea, is it doesn't really have a name. It's just its own creature that it's just sort of morphing as we go along, basically. I guess we have the same ideas. We don't want to use any sides, and it needs to be low cost. And I think where the farm is, that's, every farm in Australia is different. You can have some, we've tried to bring a European model to all Australia, and it works in favoured areas. It works really well, right? Down in the Western Districts in Victoria, you drive, the New England, the Southern Highlands, where it rains all the time and you have a little bit of a soft environment. But yeah, it's the further you get away from the sea, it's not a soft environment. It's pretty tough environment, and European farming models need to change. So we need to listen to people like Walter Yenny and Peter Andrews and these guys who've, they've been doing sort of similar to what I have, but just for a lot longer. So they have more knowledge. So it's really important to get the knowledge from these older gentlemen, I think, really is.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's so interesting you comment about European farming models. Not only do we have European farming models, but we've got European animals. And
yep.
Australia is a big country. It's a big continent, and we've got a lot of different ecosystems. And you blanket it all. But every time I talk to an established about why I'm using cattle breeds like Nguni and sheep breed like Deara, they all either raise their eyebrows or roll their eyes. And I've been to Africa twice, and I've been to England and the UK 2 or 3 times, been through Europe. I've been over 50 countries around the world. And I'll tell you what, when I come back to Australia, I see a lot more in common with the African countries I've been to than I do with England en masse. And for me, it's all about fit for purpose animals. And I go to that country up at Wyalong Way, and I can't think of anything better than some of these animals that come from this harsher country over in Africa. One of the things we're working on at Deara Heights, which is as a bit of a joke, everyone, I set up a WhatsApp group for the 3 of us to maintain communication, and WhatsApp goes group name. And I'm sitting there looking at my phone going, I don't know what the group name is. Like, do I call it Jake, Jim and Dave or something? Or I don't know, put everyone's name in there in alphabetical order, Dave, Jake and Jim. And then I thought, well, I'm sending all my sheep up there, and I've always got this joke that with my wife that wherever we live, we've always lived in sort of like Bogan areas, Lavington or Glenroy or whatever, and I always start writing instead of Glenroy, which is a bit of a Bogan area in Albury where we lived when we first got married. I started writing either Glenroy Heights or Upper Glenroy, just to make it sound a bit more posh, like Mrs. Bouquet. And so I thought Deara Heights, the Deara sheep could do with a bit of poshing up in the current climate. So that's what the WhatsApp group got a name, and it seems to have stuck. But we're looking at, one of the things I'm really excited about, Dave, is putting in this multi-species cover crop that you, Jim, and I have been speaking about, with the idea of some of that crop, that harvest being able to come back to Wolki Farm and feed the pigs, chickens. And since I posted about that on social media, I've had a lot of inquiry about it. So could you give me a bit of, or give all of us a little bit of info about what sort of plants will be in that multi-species mix? And everyone's very curious about the harvesting. How do you harvest so many different species at once? I'm assuming some might mature at 4 months of age, some might be 5, some might be 6. Like, that all sounds very complicated. And on top of all that, how do you do that without chemicals like desiccation or herbicides?
Yep. So as you probably know, like most of our crops in Australia, they're all monocultures. So, you have a crop of wheat, you have a crop of barley, you have a crop of oats, a crop of canola. And better farmers have a rotation, I guess, to get the best out of the individual biology of each of those crops. And the multi-species, it's really a play on what we do with our pastures. So when we sow a pasture, we might sow, say, phalaris, a clover, a lucerne, a chicory, because we figured out if a sheep, it doesn't matter what animal it is, if it's eating 100% phalaris, at different times of the year it's good feed, but most of the time it's actually not great feed. Whereas if you've got a different diet, you have legumes like a clover or a lucerne that obviously fix nitrogen out of the air, and the air's got 78% nitrogen in it. So if you can get farmers always go, we need nitrogen to grow a crop. Well, there's a heap of nitrogen sitting above us. It's just we've got to get it in the soil. So we need a legume in there to fix some nitrogen, which then promotes the grasses to grow. And any farmers listening, if you've got a sheep camp and the sheep bring all that manure back to the top of the hill every night, what's the deepest, darkest grass that grows on the farm? It's up in that sheep or cattle camp under the tree when it eventually rains. Nitrogen's obviously a very important part of it. Yeah, the multi-species cropping's something that's gained a lot of momentum in the last couple of years. it's interesting if you've got a crop on its own, it's sort of competing with each other. Whereas if you've got a legume in there, if the soil needs nitrogen, you'll find like the legume will grow better. So the vetch or the faba bean or the field pea will grow to fix the nitrogen. Then when the soil's reached a bit of a level where there's enough nitrogen, all of a sudden you'll see the grass grow up into the legume. And I guess it's something we've been playing around with because vetch is a really wonderful plant. It's probably the best legume for fixing a lot of. It's a very adaptable plant because you can eat it with livestock, you can turn it into hay, or you can harvest it for your own seed. So it's quite an adaptable crop. But a monoculture or a vetch, if anyone's tried to grow it, it's very doesn't have a lot of cellulose, so it has a very low carbon to nitrogen ratio, about 10-1. So as soon as it dries off very quickly, and the other thing is, as it matures later in the year, it virtually just dies on the ground. So it sort of disappears back into the soil. Whereas a crop of wheat, once that seed is developed in the head of the wheat, you've got the wheat straw there standing up. So you've got all this cover over the soil, which in Australia, particularly a Mediterranean climate, as you head south, that residue on the soil covers it from the hot sun, which is what happens up the side of the road. The grass grows, the grass seeds, and then that seed's protected from the hot sun by all the cover and stubble over the tops. What we found with vetch is if you had vetch and oats together, the oats would grow up, and the vetch all of a sudden, instead of being flat on the ground at the end of the year, it would actually curl its way up the oats, so that you could actually harvest the vetch and the oats together. So it was actually easier to harvest a vetch crop that had oats in it because the oats held it off the ground. So it was actually a 1 + 1 = 3 or 4 type scenario. Yeah, if you actually Google the some of the you've got to delve into a bit of ag science, but there's not a lot of studies where that 1 + 1 doesn't equal 3 or 4, or sometimes it can equal 11. Instead of the species competing, and I guess that's what I learned in agronomy was, you've got, if you've got this crop plant of, I've got a weed in a paddock of wheat, well, you've got to nuke it all so that you've got pure wheat so it doesn't compete with the crop. But if you get your species right, they actually complement each other, so they're actually a companion. They're like me and my Cocker Spaniel puppies, I suppose. They're a companion, and life's better when you have one. So yeah, it starts off pretty simply. So basically, you need a like a cereal, like a grass, which is a carbon accumulator. So in the case of us out there, it'll probably be like an oat, a triticale, probably be the main two, possibly a wheat, so that they all. The beauty of triticale or cereal rye will grow in quite acidic soil, and it's very, very good at sort of scavenging its own nutrients. From the sake of a grazing mix that we could sort of graze, it'd be something like oats, triticale, vetch, and peas, and possibly throw something like a tillage radish or a bit of turnip in it, which tillage radish has a big tuber, so it can actually punch a bit of a hole in the soil. So it's what I'd call or term biological deep ripping. So it actually softens up the ground. Fantastic sheep feed, because those sheep will, when the plant matures off and you have a bulb in the ground, the sheep will go through and chew that tuber, right? They'll do exceptionally well out of it. So the beauty from an animal's point of view, they get a bit of everything. They get some legume, and all these different plants have different minerals in them. So as you see your cows walking around, or the Ngunis walking around Africa, they just want to walk and graze, Jacob. If you watch animals, sheep are a little bit different. They're not I don't think as smart as possibly cattle are. Those Damaras, they certainly are pretty. They're pretty tough, and they wander around and look at things, and yeah. So animals have a really good, that's their natural instinct, isn't it? And I think you've mentioned it before. A pig's natural instincts to dig and wallow. A cow's natural instincts to wander around and graze selectively. And if we put an animal in a paddock and it's a monoculture, it doesn't. It's really interesting. I see farmers do it. And I saw a guy down the road here. He had some winter canola, which you utilise for grazing and then lock it up to harvest. and he probably had 50 weaner steers in the paddock, and the first thing they just walk around the outside of the paddock eating the weeds because they don't want to eat the canola because it's bitter or it's got too much nitrogen or whatever it is, I don't know. And you do hear of disasters when you force the animals to eat this stuff. Next minute they've got nitrate poisoning or pulpy kidney or some animal health problem, and they drop dead on you, which is never good because Jake, one thing you'll learn, they never die in a drought, but they'll drop dead when you got them on a clover and they get bloat. They'll die with excess, basically. So that's one frustrating thing with animals is that, just when you think they're worth some money and there's really good feed there, they'll drop dead on you. So, yeah, the grazing mix, the other thing we're talking about is a mix for the pigs. That's a little bit different in that we'll run that through to harvest, and my ideas there is something like probably basically trit and lupins would be the mainstay of that mix. So again, we've got a legume and a grass, so we've got a mix of species. I think a bit of vetch in there, a bit of a field pea, virtually a similar mix, but the lupins will probably add that. Lupins are a very sweet protein, which the pigs actually love, I'm pretty sure. It was something we need to do a bit of research on, but the beauty of this is once you have your seed, it's a fairly low cost. It's a low cost operation. Once you've got seed, and if you sow it, the idea being that the different plants find their own nutrition, right? So the beauty of vetch, it's what's called a mycorrhizal fungi host. So remember that we're driving down the lane and I showed you the mycorrhizal fungi associated on the side of the road with the gum trees. So that's the natural way that those trees find their nutrients. And
I thought you were gonna
with fungi,
hop out of the car and grill them up like buttered mushrooms. You were so excited.
Yeah. Oh, well, I think we were just there at the right time after the rain, but that was up the side of that road. I mean, it was just Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, what struck me? I thought about that a couple of days later, and the only place we saw that was on the side of the hard-packed road.
Yep. Yeah. The trouble in a paddock, cultivation's really hard on the mycorrhizal fungi, and obviously if you use a fungicide on your crop, it's also detrimental. In my work as an agronomist and the last couple of years, we've seen quite a bit of stripe rust, which you've probably heard about in the wheat. So you spray a fungicide on your wheat crop. That's fine. It kills the stripe rust, but it also kills all the beneficial fungi. So you have all these unintended consequences, and it's really interesting. I'll see paddocks where guys, they might run out and they don't do a strip, and so you have an area of the paddock that is unsprayed with fungicide, and what I'll find is that stubble will turn, if it gets a bit of summer rain, it turns black and it starts breaking down. Whereas with the fungicide, the stubble stays white and clean, doesn't break down. It does cover the soil, but the problem is you come to March and you want to sow the crop and you've got all this stubble there that's still there. So I have a couple of my clients, they haven't used fungicide for probably 5 to 10 years, just from a sort of starting down this, I don't really want to say regenerative, Jacob.
Just say it.
I've said it. I've said it. Heading down this path, and what I find is the stubble, and particularly if we use a companion crop. So I'll give you an example. We've got a winter wheat, and it's been grazed with the sheep, and we've actually undersowed it with clover. So the clover sits under the crop of wheat. And we harvest the wheat, and then you put the sheep or the cattle or whatever you do. In this case, it's sheep. The sheep will eat that clover and even the clover burr underneath the straw. And that straw, by come March, it's just disappeared. So it's mulched back into the soil, and the soil's really soft and friable. And you get a little bit of rain, and you're ready to sow it again. So it's a really, unless you're observing these things, which is I guess it's why I like my job, Jacob. I get to get into a lot of paddocks and observe all these things, and I've got to. I guess I've probably learnt, and I think I mentioned it. I've trained up quite a few young agronomists, and they come straight out of uni, and of course now they're addicted to their phone. Like everyone under probably 30, and rather than sit there and you spend a lot of time in the car going from job to job instead of looking out the window at things and up. This grass up the side of the road or the fungi on the side of the road, they've got their head in their phone looking at Snapchat. And, whereas you really, your job as an agronomist is to observe things, I think. I'm afraid I think we've lost the natural ability to just notice things, keep our eyes open. Maybe I'm just getting old, I don't know.
I love that, David. I'm actually writing that down. Your job as an agronomist is to observe things. I think that's a great quote, and I'm gonna popularize that with your name on it. I'm just going to wrap up this part of the interview now, and then we'll hop into a Q&A, which we probably won't publish the Q&A. That'll just be exclusive for the school members in here that are watching live at the moment. I was chatting to a friend of mine, Dan, earlier today, who you're familiar with. You haven't met yet, but I've told you about him a couple of times. He's helping me develop some farm stuff, and he made this really interesting quote, and I also wrote that down in my little quote folder here on my phone. And because if I don't write it down, it goes in one ear, out the other. And he said, cattle farmers don't acknowledge what we do because they can't understand it. We don't acknowledge what they do because we can't stand it. And I just thought that was a really interesting quote. And, what I wanted to draw out of that is, to me, you're a little bit of an ag shifter. I'm about to coin a new term, but we all know the term shapeshifter, people who can, sort of mythology where people can morph shape. Maybe they turn into a werewolf or whatever. And I'm classing you as a type of farmer, a type of agricultural person who is an ag shifter, because you can walk into a conventional commodity system with all the good old boys who do it the way they do it, and you understand what they do, you understand the reasons, you can talk to them about the pros and cons and be respected as a peer. But at the same time, you can roll with the no-till guys, you can hang out with the regeners, you're a certified organic farmer yourself, and if one of your conventional clients calls you and wants to talk about no-till cropping or dialing back the fungicide or herbicide one year, you're a very unique agronomist where you've got that skill set and interest, and you can maybe put them on a bit of a weaning program. And I think that's really cool. And I think that term ag shifter's got a bit of oomph behind it. I'll give that to you there, and you can run with that. Maybe you and Jim can be the first two ag shifter agronomists. There you go, ag for agronomists, ag shifters.
Yeah. Look, and look, farmers are, it was Peter Andrews was on a podcast, and I think it might have been with Charlie Arnott. It was a really good listen. It was pretty entertaining, and Peter's pretty dry. I don't know if you've heard him talk. I'd love to go to one of his field days whilst he's still kicking, but he said farmers, they're 1% of 1%, which if you think about it, there's less and less farmers because, farm succession, who gets the farm, it's got to be split up. So it's often easier to sell this farm and cash the money and go to town and get a 9-to-5 job, because farming, it's pretty tough. It's still very enjoyable, and it's a business, but it's also, like I deal with family farms exclusively. I don't do any corporate stuff, and that's actually by choice for a number of reasons. There's another hour discussion there about corporate farming, Jacob, sometime. Unfortunately, Australia's really, I've gone down that rabbit hole now, but I suppose, and you look at Woolies and Coles, and what have they got? 80% of the market share. Well, they don't want to deal with David Bushell at bloody Temora or Jacob Wolki. They want to deal with Cargill. So the big boys sort of move all this produce around, and they'll use growers to grow stuff, but they really want to. They need bulk produce to fill all their stores. The trouble, as we saw in COVID, is if there's if there's a cyclone in Queensland, well, guess what? There's no bananas. I think most tomatoes are grown in a greenhouse now. I think in the States, Driscoll's have got most of the berries, which are hydroponics. Yeah, we've really centralised this big farming system, haven't we? Where it's big farms dealing with big suppliers, at either end of the scale, and it is pretty hard being a family farm because you're selling to a multinational like Cargill. You're buying your fertiliser off Nutrien, which is a Canadian company, and you're just trying to run this little farm. So I completely understand conventional farmers there. It's why you see on Twitter, Jacob, there's a lot of anger and frustration, and farmers really, back when I started farming, we had the AWB. We
I
put our
never
wheat
picked
in the
up on that
pool.
anger and frustration.
Did you write that down too?
Yeah.
Or you didn't pick it?
I've never felt that on Twitter.
I know you enjoy it, which is really good, and that's I guess that squeeze that's been going on, and I reckon it's getting worse. It's I'm not really sure how you break it. I know you're trying, and I like the fact that you're direct to market. The simple fact is, if you look at farmers, we're getting less and less share of the produce. That's the trouble. I think grain, it's something like 3%, like a amount of wheat that goes into a loaf of bread. That's why the processed food industry, there's such a lot of money behind it, because basically you bring a low cost product like wheat, or in the case of wheat, well, if you add sugar to it, you've got a sweet item, and if you add salt to it, you've got a savoury item, and it's all pretty.
Yeah.
You can add your secret herbs and spices, and there you go. You got some food, but it's all made out of the same stuff, basically.
Well, I've got an interesting little tidbit to talk about. That 3% you mentioned, and then we'll wrap up this part, and we'll say goodbye to everybody, and then we'll get into the Q&A for the school members, and we'll let everyone off in the next 15 minutes or so. But at this Nutrisoil event you mentioned earlier that I was at, it was first week of March this year, 2024. Young Haggerty, what's his name? Is it Matt Haggerty, the son, was there, and he gave a presentation. Young guy.
I haven't met the hack.
Yeah, young guy, great young guy. A lot of experience on the family farm. Travelled around Europe, worked at some organic farms. Was absolutely aghast at the heavy tillage and soil loss he saw on these certified organic operations. Like he said, the conversation from the management there was, 7-8 years, they don't know how they're going to get a crop in the ground because they're, throwing their soil around so much. Just really interesting stuff. But he said that they've been, that's an enormous operation, 25,000 hectares or, whatever it is in West Australia. And they've been selling grain to one of the local bakeries. And his parents phoned in and did a Q&A, and I was really interested because I've just given my presentation about selling direct, and everyone listens to me selling direct, and it all sounds great, but who could be bothered going to all the effort to sell half a dozen lambs a fortnight to the local butcher to start up a little fledgling direct-to-market enterprise on the side, right? And here you've got the Haggertys, who are well known in Australia for pioneering natural sequence farming tens of thousands of hectares of land, and they're talking about how they were driving, 4 hours each way into town to drop off 40 kilos of wheat or whatever it might have been. And I said to them, why do you do it? Is it worthwhile? Tell me more about that. It doesn't sound like it makes any more sense. And they said, well, it never made sense financially. But in terms of the reward and the satisfaction and the consumer feedback and the relationships and the experience about supply chain we're getting out of it, it's priceless. And instead of driving down for, two little 20 kilo sacks now we're filling up IBCs and bulker bags and driving that into them, and still 1 ton in a bulker bag, still not much grain, but they were talking about their plans to expand their supply direct into bakeries. And I was chatting to Matt about it. He's like, well, maybe we could supply more bakeries. And I said, man, you don't want to supply the bakeries. They think they're getting a bigger piece of the pie going from selling into a commodity market with, whole grain wheat and then milling it or selling it to a bakery for them to mill themselves. And they think that they're closing the cycle, which they are a little bit. But I said, Matt, think bigger. Don't sell to the bakery. Be the bakery. The guy cooking the wheat, the guy growing the wheat is selling the croissant.
Yeah.
Take that 80 gram of wheat and get $9.50 for it in the center of Sydney. Like, let's go. I know it's easier said than done, more than most would, because I'm involved in many points along that supply chain. But it's a fun journey, and there's very few industries with all the pitfalls in commodity industries, Dave. I think one of the biggest pitfalls is there's normally a buyer, so you get lazy. You don't have to fight for anything. In my bike shop, there's never a buyer. If I don't offer good service, if I don't back up good service, if I'm not consistent, if I'm not open 7 days a week, in my cafe, if my staff are grumpy and they frown too much, if we open late, there's so many variables. If we don't turn up and execute everything brilliantly, our business falls over. But, of course, these commodity farmers are great. Their crop gets graded and they get paid, a bumper or a discount or whatever it is. But the reality is there's still a market to tip that into, and it's just bred complacency. And yeah, it's let the farmers do what they're good at and try to get a yield at. But I don't think holistically, it's paying off for all the externalized factors there. So any final comments from you, and then we'll roll into a Q&A.
Yep. No, you've hit the nail on the head, Jacob. Look, you can prove anything on paper, and people go, "Oh, well, this regenerative farming, it doesn't work," blah blah blah. But look, at the end of the day, yes, it's probably lower output, but it's also far lower input, and that's really, if you look at farms, you've got the cost of land, you've got the cost of all the products, you've got the cost of machinery if you're growing grain, which is quite high. How do you in that cropping cycle, we really only look at sort of a 6 to 12 month cycle. So we just, what did it cost to grow this wheat? What did it cost per tonne to grow? How much did we grow? What's our profit? But I mean, we're not looking at, have we improved the soil health, or we mined it rather than farming it? So, I've been to all the, and I do presentations myself, and you look at the economics, and people analyse all this and that, and I mean, it externalises all those other costs, right? Which you talk about soil carbon, which I mentioned before. We do have a system in Australia now where farmers can get paid for improving their soil with carbon. It's not perfect, but it's definitely a step in the right direction, because up for the last 200 years we've been paid to burn it up, basically. Like I said, I suppose with a farm it's a business, but it's also, you imagine your bike shop, Jacob, and you live there. So a farm, you live on it normally. It has emotional value, it has all these other values. It is, and it's also a business. That's why it's very, very hard to, like I said, Peter Andrews summed it up. He said farmers are 1% of 1%. So, yeah, that's why why we're all probably a little bit different, I'd suggest, particularly in Australia.
Absolutely, and the climate we farm in, is known for making, pioneering a lot of innovation, but I'm sure it hardens a lot of people that are working it as well.
Yeah.
Righty, everyone.
Absolutely.
Thanks for listening, and you're about to miss out on our Q&A with our school community. If you'd like to join our school community, you can go to skool.com and search for Wolki Farm and join our little paywalled group there.